It's it's so great to be here in Denver. I've never spent much time in the city, and I'm amazed and astonished to see a full room. I'm very happy for AA's first time here for that to have sold out, and I'm optimistic that that means that maybe they'll come back again, because I would like to come back sometime when I haven't, for some strange reason, ended up injuring my knee right before I arrived. So if you see me limping around a little bit, that's what's going on, and I hope to come back sometime and be able to walk around your city and see what it's like. So I'm here to talk to you today about progressive web apps, and I want to start by asking you a question. Have you heard the hype around progressive web apps? And if you haven't, don't worry, because the tech press isn't going to let you get away for much longer without telling you about it. They're writing articles about how Google and others are plotting the revenge of the web app. And since I'm here to talk to you about that, I guess that makes me part of some sort of secret cabal out to get native app developers or something. So if you're in the audience, I guess beware. They're also writing articles about how progressive web apps promise to upend native apps. We are no longer going to need native. We're only going to need the web. It's going to be just as the father of the internet, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, always intended it, or something like that. It's not really how it works. They're so excited about, they're saying that native apps have one foot in the grave, which is really astonishing, because it wasn't that long that Wired was talking about how the web was dead. I think that both of these takes might be a little bit premature. I don't know if you saw this, but Wired actually updated this. They did a follow-up to this article where they said that the web isn't dead after all. Google saved the web. Hallelujah. Thank you, Google. I have a little bit of an attachment to the web. I was really sad when I found out that it was dead, but it's been resurrected, and we should thank Google for that. And you'll be surprised to know that the way that Google saved the web was via progressive web apps. So I'm making fun a little bit here, but this is happening over and over again, right? Like, the media loves pitting one group against another. You know, red states and blue states, and vegans and paleo, and Vim and Emacs, and of course, like what they've been doing since the iPhone came out, which is this battle between native developers and mobile web developers. And I've got to tell you, I'm insanely tired of this. I'm so tired of having this discussion. It's infuriating. Like, we've been talking about this since 2008. So I want to just take a deep breath, because this stuff matters, right? We're really early in the Gartner hype cycle for progressive web apps. We're probably about here. Most people don't even know yet what progressive web apps can do. And if people think that progressive web apps are going to lead to the demise of native applications, that slope down to the trough of disillusionment isn't going to look like some sort of fun roller coaster ride. It's just going to be a cliff that we're all going to get pushed off of. So I'm here to cut through the hype around progressive web apps, to talk about why they matter, what they can do for your organization, why they make sense. Then I'm going to talk about some of the design challenges, the design decisions you're going to need to make almost immediately after you decide to do a progressive web app. And then talk about how you can incrementally build towards a progressive web app. So let's start with what is a progressive web app. And to do this, I want to show you a little video that Google put together talking about progressive web apps for one of their recent conferences.
The only thing that evolves faster than technology is our expectations. We want everything. Better, easier, now. Suddenly, downloading an app feels like it takes forever. And in many parts of the world, data is still at a premium, with 1 megabyte costing up to 5% of a monthly wage. Let's face it though, until now, the alternative to native apps hasn't been great. But that was then. Progressive web apps can now deliver mobile web experiences with a native look and feel, offering features like real-time push notifications, adding a site to your home screen so you can easily jump back to it with a single tap, even when you're offline. Plus the ability to make quick payments on the go. And all from your browser. This is the next generation of the mobile web. So what are we waiting for? Let's go and build something great.
Okay. It got a little crazy there at the end, right? Like maybe I shouldn't be blaming the media for hyping up progressive web apps. Like, they're not alone in that. I mean, there was some reality in that. If you do build a progressive web app, you will have 4 horses that go down a beach with some sunset behind it. It's amazing. It's magical. So progressive web apps is a phrase coined by Francis Berryman and Alex Russell to describe what they were seeing in a new generation of websites, what those websites provided. And they provided a whole list of features that were part of what they see as part of progressive web apps. But in essence, what we're talking about are features that used to not be available for the web, that you needed to use a mobile or a native application in order to use. And some of the key things, at least from my perspective, is to have something that is nearly instantaneous, that loads really fast, that is available offline, that's secure, that you can use, that you can add to your home screen, have an icon that you can use push notifications with. And something that's responsive so that it works no matter what type of device somebody uses. The early examples of progressive web apps are really impressive. So Flipkart is an e-commerce company in India. Really interesting because they decided that they hated their mobile website so much that they were going to stop using it entirely and try to drive everyone to their native app. And then their sales didn't do so well. And so they decided to come back to the web. And when they did, they built this application to be as fluid and responsive as what they expected from a native application. So this progressive web app that you're seeing, you can see how the animation, how the experience is really great. And then if you go offline, you can continue to access the application. And since they've implemented their progressive web app, they've seen sales increase. Twitter also recently launched a progressive web app. They call it Twitter Lite. They did this again as something that they wanted to be able to use in emerging markets, but there are a lot of people who really like the Twitter Lite application and are starting to use it just generally. Since they've launched Twitter Lite, they've seen a 65% increase in pages per session, a 75% increase in tweets sent, and a 20% decrease in bounce rate. There are a lot of people who are familiar with what's going on with the web that the first time they start looking at progressive web apps wonder, like, really, is there anything to this? Is this just a progressive website? I got asked whether there was anything different between a progressive web app and just regular web best practices other than push notifications and a manifest file. And I've got to tell you, that was my reaction the first time I heard about progressive web apps. I couldn't figure out why anyone was excited about them. And what changed it for me was I was speaking on a panel at a marketing conference. And one of the questions that the moderator asked just randomly happened to be something that triggered progressive web apps in my mind. And so I talked about it for a little bit. And then I got several follow-up questions from the audience. And then after the session, people were asking more and more questions about progressive web apps. And I realized that progressive web apps, even though it was technology that I was aware of, things like service workers and push notifications, things that I had been watching for a while, that the entire concept was something that got people very excited. Francis Berryman, who helped coin the phrase, recently wrote about how the name isn't for us, essentially. It isn't for developers, for designers. It's really about it's a name for your boss, for your investor, for your marketer. It's something that gets people excited about investing in the web again. For those of you who want sort of a very technical definition, I really like what Jeremy Keith wrote recently, which is that any site can be a progressive web app if they simply switch to HTTPS, add a manifest file, which is a simple JSON document, and add a service worker. We'll talk about service workers a little bit more. Aaron also wrote an article for, Aaron who's speaking tomorrow, wrote an article for A List Apart talking about how any website should be a progressive web app, and he provides a lot of different examples of how that works. So because progressive web apps are web best practices, browsers are providing incentives for organizations that build progressive web apps. For example, on Chrome on Android, if you have a progressive web app and Chrome observes enough user interaction with your site, they'll prompt somebody to actually add it to their home screen. Their hope is that by observing user behavior and only prompting somebody when they actually seem to be interested, when they're likely to add it to their home screen, that they can increase conversion rate. And so far, it actually looks good. Alex Russell has written about the fact that the Chrome team has seen progressive web app add to home screen banners convert 5 to 6 times more than the install banners that we see for native applications. Now, some of that might be heuristics, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the process of installing a native application is really onerous, right? You go to a website, and every website in the world is like, install our app, and you're like, close, I don't care, I don't care, I don't care. Maybe eventually you say, maybe I'm interested in this. Then you have to go launch the App Store app. You have to wait for it to launch to find it. Then you add it. Maybe you go to install it. Maybe you have to authenticate yourself in some manner, type in your password. Then it downloads. Then you open the app. Then you go and log in the app. Like, all of those are steps and barriers to entry. The thing about a progressive web app is that it's installed the first time somebody visits your site, because it is just your site. The icon on the home screen is just a cherry on top. And so when they get to that point of the process, that is nearly instantaneous. Adding it to the home screen isn't a big install process. It's just adding it to the home screen. Really nice and easy. Operating systems like Android are also doing other things to deeply integrate progressive web apps. So within Android now, progressive web apps show up inside the dock and the trays and also in settings. So you're able to have that better experience. There are a bunch of things that are coming soon. For example, app stores. So Microsoft has already announced that they're going to put progressive web apps into the Microsoft Store. You can get in there 2 ways. You can submit your progressive web app to the Microsoft Store. But because it's on the web, Bing will start searching through websites. And if they notice the manifest file and see that it's a progressive web app, and they decide that it's of a certain level of quality, they will go ahead and put it in the Microsoft Store automatically. So all of a sudden, you're getting a bunch of new audiences. From a Google perspective, I'm not entirely certain whether they will or won't put this in Google Play. But there's at least a strong indicator. Alex Russell had written about the fact that he speculated that Microsoft might do exactly what Microsoft announced, but that he had no insights into what Microsoft would do. But he does work for Google, and they have their own search company and their own app store, so he might have some insights in what they're doing. It's also possible now, just last month or the month before, they announced this new bit of technology for Android called Trusted Web Activities, which make it really easy to wrap up a progressive web app and submit it into the Google Play Store. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention yet, but I think you're going to see a lot of people start to use that technology. There are also SEO benefits. So again, Microsoft has announced that progressive web apps will be highlighted in Bing search results. And also, I think that there's a good chance that we may see in Google search results the same sort of badging that we see for AMP pages showing up for PWAs at some point in the future. But even if browsers weren't doing this, even if they weren't providing any incentives for creating progressive web apps, they would still make sense for your site. And they make sense irrespective of what you're doing on native applications. So I want to provide you with 6 arguments that I believe even a native app developer could agree with. The first is that not every customer or potential customer will have your app installed. Now, you're probably thinking, well, duh, like, why do we have to say that? But I think sometimes it's really important to restate the obvious. I have these conversations with companies a lot where they'll say, we don't need a progressive web app, we already have a native app. And I have to remind them, well, not like probably 100% of your potential customers don't have your app installed. They don't even know about you yet. And for the customers who do have your native app installed, they may be on a device, maybe on their desktop computer, where they don't have the native app installed. So providing a better web experience for your customers makes some sense. Plus, frankly, there's some cracks in the App Store that progressive web apps help us sort of fill around. I mean, there are over 2 million applications on the iOS and Android app stores. Being able to stand out in those app stores is really, really difficult. Being able to put stuff on the web and sort of do social and do the other pieces is a good way to get attention. In the United States, the average smartphone user installs 0 apps per month. It's going to be hard to get people to install your application. And if you do manage to do it, the retention rates are pretty depressing as well. So the average app on the Android store loses 77% of its daily active users within the first 3 days of its install. Within 30 days, it's lost 90%. Within 90 days, it's lost over 95% of its daily active users. So getting people to install that application is difficult, and getting them to stay in the application is also difficult. Plus, we have just generally the fact that we don't know what's going to happen in these app stores. We don't have control. So just last week, I was reading about the fact that Apple has widened a ban on templated applications, and that because of it, a lot of small businesses are losing their apps from the App Store. So being in the App Store is no longer sufficient. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be in the App Store, but you need to make sure that you are doing things to touch customers wherever they're interacting with you. And the mobile web has audiences that are 3 times as large and growing twice as fast as native apps. Right? It's likely the first interaction somebody is going to have with your organization is through the web, not through the native application. And so your chances of getting them to install the native application are much better if that experience from the web is much better. And progressive web apps are a way to do that. Second, you should provide a secure site or app for your customers, right? Like if you're doing e-commerce or doing anything sensitive, you should be concerned about these people, and maybe these people. And really, we should encrypt all of the web, right? That's the responsible thing to do. And encrypting the web is really important to browser makers. So what they're starting to do is they're saying, hey, if you want to use geolocation, I know you used to be able to use it on a non-secure site. Now you have to have a secure site before you can use geolocation, because that's sensitive private information. If you want to use new features like HTTP2, which is a new, faster way of interacting and building websites, you have to be on HTTPS. And to build a progressive web app, the bare minimum is that you have to have a secure site. You should do that. You should do it anyways. But if you want a PWA, you have to do it. 3, you should provide a fast experience for your customers, your web customers. As Una was saying last time, in the last session, we know that web performance makes a big difference in conversion and sales. And so what we've seen is that progressive web apps are a great way to provide a more performant experience. The Washington Post had done a ton of work to reduce their website to be, their mobile website to be 3.3 seconds. And that was phenomenal work. They had really, really optimized it. When they made it a progressive web app, they got it to be less than a second. At less than a second, it will feel nearly instantaneous as somebody moves page to page. All of this happens because of a technology called service workers. Service workers is a way that we as web developers can say explicitly to the browser, I want you to cache this asset, and I want to cache it forever or for however long. And if you get a request for this, go to the cache and then maybe look to the network, or go to the network and then look to the cache. You get complete control over what happens. And because of that, we can take the assets that are commonly used and make sure the browser caches them. In essence, this is what native applications do, right? You download a whole binary with a bunch of information that's stored locally on your device so that when you launch it, it's really quick because everything's stored locally, other than the new content. Well, that's what we can do with progressive web apps because of service workers. All right, the fourth thing, your customers might benefit from an offline experience, right? Maybe, it depends on what your site is. But you know what's great about this? Service workers are also the key to providing offline support. Because what do? They allow you to say specifically what should be available offline. So if you're already doing service workers to make something performant, you could look around a little bit and decide, hey, what else might we have offline that would benefit our customers? 5, your customers might benefit from push notifications. Again, it depends a little bit on what your business is. But if you're eBay, for example, and somebody comes to an auction page, and they're not somebody who normally has the native app installed, but it's something that they're interested in, right now, prior to progressive web apps, you would have to say to them, hey, to get a notification 5 minutes before this auction ends, you're going to have to install the native application, then you're going to have to create an account, you're going to have to ask for permission to allow us to send notifications. Instead, in that web page, you could just simply say, do you want to be notified 5 minutes before the auction ends? And if the person clicks that button, then ask for permission, and then provide them with that notification, all from within the browser without asking them to take on a larger relationship with you. And then the sixth thing, right, you can create a text file, right? Make some icons, because that's all that's left. Manifest files are the way that you declare that your site is a progressive web app. And there's simply a JSON document that declares what the name of the app should be and what the description is and where the icons are and what color background you want when the site launches. See, progressive web apps simply make sense because every step on the path to a progressive web app makes sense on its own. It's what we should do to have a better experience for the people that we serve. Right? We should provide a better web experience, and progressive web apps are the way to do that. And the early returns on progressive web apps are incredibly promising. So Extra Electronics has found that they've seen a 12% increase in click-through rate, 100% more sales from people who are arriving via web push, a 4x increase in re-engagement. 5 Miles has seen a 50% decrease in bounce rate, 30% more time spent on site, 30% more conversion for people who arrive via the add to home screen function. Hola Cabs, this is the one that I really like because not only do they see higher conversion and higher conversion than what they see for their native applications in what are called Tier 3 cities in India. So Tier 3 cities have less infrastructure than other cities. And so they're seeing higher conversion on their PWA than they are on their native application. But that last bullet is key. They're seeing that 20% of their users are people who had previously uninstalled the native application, right? They probably uninstalled it to save storage space or to do maybe because they found that it was too heavy or it was taking too much time. I don't know why they uninstalled it, but they're gaining customers back by providing a progressive web app. Pinterest also recently launched a progressive web app. They're seeing time spent on site increasing greater than 5 minutes, up 40%. User-generated ad revenue, up 44%. Ad click-through rates up 50%, core engagements up 60%. Great, great results. As a matter of fact, we see so many of these stories that we started this website, pwastats.com, where we keep track of case studies where people are talking about sort of the increases in conversion and revenue and performance that they're seeing from implementing progressive web apps. So there's a good chance that you're going to find an organization that's similar to yours talking about what they've done. And look on PWA stats. We try to keep track of them. Now, the most common objection that I hear from people about progressive web apps is, well, this is great, but iOS doesn't support progressive web apps. Well, no. I mean, progressive web apps work fine on iOS because they're progressive. They use progressive enhancement. We've got a baseline experience that works on any device. And then if the device happens to support service workers, then we get additional features. And if it happens to support push notifications, then we get additional features. So this isn't a problem. Plus, there are billions of people who use browsers right now that support PWA features. And service workers are coming to Apple. They've already announced that they're working on service workers. So the most important features, at least from my perspective of progressive web apps, are going to come to iOS. Now, we don't know yet if all of them will come, and it's very likely that we'll see different implementations. Like the add to home screen prompt that I was showing earlier isn't the way that Firefox decided to implement add to home screen. For them, it's a badge inside the address bar that you have to select. They don't prompt somebody to add it to home screen. So each browser is going to do some different implementations of progressive web apps, but the core thing that sort of prevents iOS from having the benefits of service workers, it's getting addressed. Plus, the funny thing is that the organizations that are actually working on progressive web apps now are already seeing benefits on iOS. So AliExpress sees a 104% increase in new user conversion across all browsers, but they see 82% increase in iOS conversion. The Washington Post has talked about how they see a 5x increase in user engagement. And I asked their product manager, well, was there a difference between what they saw in Android and iOS users? And they said that all PWA has higher engagement. There's minimal difference. So why is this? Like, why are people seeing benefits on iOS, even though iOS doesn't yet support the features from a progressive web app? And I think the reason why is because it's about performance. See, in the process of working on a progressive web app, you usually spend time thinking about the performance. Like, that's one of the key things you're doing. And that work, some of it's going to be related to service workers, but some of it's just going to be the work that you do that's housekeeping that'll let you have a faster site. So in many ways, progressive web apps end up being sort of a Trojan horse for performance inside your organizations. Because the tools that we use for progressive web apps, things like Lighthouse that measure your performance or sort of your success in building a progressive web app, have quite a bit of emphasis on performance. One of the big boons from progressive web apps is related to performance. So progressive web apps will simply make sense for your organization because not all of your customers have your native app installed, because you should provide a secure site anyways. You should provide a fast experience, and this is one of the best ways to do it. Your customers might benefit from an offline experience. They might benefit from push notifications. And adding a manifest file is like a half hour's worth of work. So they make sense. They're something that you should do. But just because they make sense doesn't necessarily mean that they're simple to design and build. Some of the decisions that you make can have large ramifications in the size of a progressive web app project. In many ways, I think what happens in progressive web apps is that there are some unanswered questions that we have from the earliest days of the iPhone release that we never really addressed on the web side. So if we go back and we look at like WP Touch, it's this plugin for WordPress. This is what it looked like shortly after the iPhone came out. And what you see is, at that point in time, was a lot of websites attempting to ape native conventions. And in particular, trying to ape iPhone OS. It wasn't even iOS. Trying to ape iPhone OS at that point in time. This is what WP Touch looks like now. Now, it's not iOS. It's not Android. It's got pieces of each of them. I mean, like, the best description I have is that it's mobile-y or responsive-y. I don't know how to describe it, but it's clearly not meant to look like specifically an iOS application. But not that long ago, I was reading this article by Owen Campbell-Moore, who's one of the product managers for progressive web apps at Google. He was writing about how to create compelling UX for progressive web apps. And he said that when it comes to visual design and interaction patterns, we should start by forgetting everything we know about conventional web design and instead imagining that you're designing a native app. Like, what? Like, really? Forget everything we've learned? I mean, he makes an interesting argument. And actually, I recommend reading the entire article because there's a lot of good stuff in the article. Even if there are points that I disagree with, I think it's really good. But he says that it's important because people who are using progressive web apps on their phone right next to a native application, right? One icon's native, one icon's a progressive web app, that people have expectations about what that experience is going to look like. And these are the questions that I think we never answered sort of early on after the iPhone was released from a web perspective. They're questions like, what makes something an app? Right? Like, we have no common definition for this. Jeremy's written about this multiple times. Chris actually did a survey on CSS Tricks, asking people a poll, like trying to get some sort of consistency on what our definition of an app was. And the reality is that we have no common definition. So what's going to happen inside your organization is somebody's going to say, we need to do a progressive web app, and everybody in the room is going to have a different idea in their head. Right? The second thing that we don't know in any way, shape, or form, because we haven't had a lot of experience with it yet, is how do users' expectations change when they consider something to be an app? And this is probably the more important question for us to answer. These questions manifest in sort of the design decisions that we're going to make. So I want to look at these in sort of 4 related questions, and then we'll talk about a few important details that seem clear that we need to get right when we first start doing progressive web apps. So the first question is, how much does your design match the platform? So Owen, in his article, wrote about how we could use system font declarations in our CSS to have something use Roboto on Android and use San Francisco on iOS. And that we should do this sort of stuff so that our apps fit in better alongside the native applications. But the question becomes, like, how many of these platforms are we going to do that for, right? And what about desktop browsers? Our progressive web app should be responsive, which means that it should be used on desktop as well. And we've never really tried to fit into what the Mac OS looked like or what Windows OS looked like. And are we going to jump every time there's a new design system for these platforms? Microsoft earlier this year released Fluent design system. I think it's really, really nice. I actually like it better than Material Design. But I wouldn't build a site using Fluent design because I would want the site to look like my organization, like whatever it is that whatever brand I'm trying to convey. So I believe that for at least this question, it seems pretty clear that we would be much better off if we design our own design, we define our own design and be consistent across platforms. This is Tripcase. It's actually a PhoneGap application. We worked on it a little bit a few years ago. And the design, though, was done by Sabre. And they had a design that works well and fits in on either Android or iPhone. It doesn't necessarily feel Android specific. It doesn't feel iPhone specific. It's a really, really good experience, though. Second question, right? What impact does going Chromeless have on our user experiences? What I mean by going Chromeless is that inside our manifest file, we can declare different display modes. We can say, you should have a display mode that's like a browser. So now we've got the address bar, we've got the menu, we've got everything else. You can have a display mode that's standalone, where the address bar's gone away. We've got a display mode of full screen. There's also one called Minimal UI, which none of the browsers have implemented yet, but that Chrome is working on and should be coming out soon. As you move from left to right, like you lose things. You lose the URL, you lose tabs, you lose the menu. When you go all the way to full screen, you lose the back button, plus everything you lost before. Now, for those of you who don't use Android devices, I do want to point out that you're not going to get stuck inside a progressive web app. You can actually pull down to reload or swipe up from the bottom, and you'll get the navigation bar. But as you can see on the right on our site, sometimes the navigation bar is really hard to see. We've been spoiled by browsers. We don't realize how good we've had it, how much they've taken care of us in terms of the things that they provide users of our websites. There's the obvious stuff like the status bar, the address bar, the navigation bar. But there's also things like, hey, inside the menu, we get access to refresh and to download and tabs and find in page. That's a pretty cool feature. Kind of sucks that when we go full screen, we're going to lose it. Or, under sharing, printing and emailing. These are fundamental features that are part of the browser that we don't really think about. So when we move away from those warm comforts, we are in the native app space in a lot of ways. We're going to have to re-implement a lot of things that browsers provide for us and figure out how we're going to do it. And even simple things are actually harder than we think. So adding a back button, for example, means managing the browser's history. In apps, it oftentimes implies an app hierarchy. So, for example, we're on a category page, and then we pogo stick down to a detail page, and then we go back up to a category page, and then down to another detail page. This is the behavior from a native app perspective. If we look at the same progressive web app, this example that Google did, but we assume, for example, that maybe somebody followed a link from social media, we end up inside a web page where, hey, we've got an arrow up there. Where does that arrow go to? Because I was just previously on a different website. And does it do the same thing as the browser back button, which looks almost exactly the same and is only placed a few pixels above it? They don't go to the same place. One of them goes up in the app hierarchy, and the other one goes back to the previous page. If there's browser Chrome, should there even be an app in-page back button? Right? I don't know the answer to this question. I think we're all going to end up experimenting with this. The good news is that there's actually a new media query that we can use that we can look for the display mode. And so we might decide that the button only makes sense in a situation where we're full screen and we hide it in other instances. The reason I point this out, and I want to make, drill home on this idea, is that not every customer or potential customer will add your progressive web app to the home screen. In the same way in which responsive design forced us to start designing for a range of different screen sizes, when it comes to progressive web apps, we have to design for a range of different contexts. Because sometimes the Chrome's going to be there, sometimes the Chrome isn't going to be there. The good news is that, unlike native applications, every visitor will install your progressive web app, because the installation process happens automatically behind the scenes. It's also really important, right, that you understand that going full screen implies a bunch of additional things that you might not otherwise think about, because it's just one line in your manifest file, right? But that one line implies that you're going to implement a back button. And implementing a back button implies that you're going to manage the browser's history. It probably implies that you're going to do a single page application. Doesn't necessarily, but that's probably one way you might do it. So that one little line makes a difference. Another question, should you app shell or not app shell? So app shell is this concept that Google's been promoting. Basically, the idea is that for any particular application, there's a shell. If you think about back when I first was working on the web, we used to call them the C clamp, right? You had the header and the left nav and the footer. Maybe I'm old and nobody else used C clamp, but anyways, it's the artifacts around the application. So because we have service workers, we can actually tell the browser, store that stuff offline. And the benefit of that is that the perceived performance of your progressive web app is much better, because we can load that from the cache instantly. So that skeleton or that app shell, whatever you want to call it, will load really quickly. I think that this is actually part of the reason why the Washington Post has seen big improvements on iOS, even though on iOS it doesn't support service workers. So I'm going to show you a video in just a second. The Washington Post was really great as a case study because you could opt into their PWA experience while their older mobile experience was still available. So you could do side-by-side comparisons. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to navigate from one page to another. I'm going to click through to an article. And on the right, which is the PWA with App Shell, what I want you to notice is that the navigation bar is going to stay there the whole time. We never get that full white page loading experience, and things start coming in more quickly. On the left, we get a more traditional loading experience. But the second thing to pay attention to is the browser's loading bars. Because in this particular test, the mobile web experience, the non-PWA experience, actually loads completely faster than the PWA, even though the PWA is faster. I'm telling you all this because it's going to happen really quickly. All right, you ready? Here we go. So now this isn't always the case. It isn't always the case that the mobile web experience loads faster than the progressive web app experience, but it was true in this. But the progressive web app experience feels much faster. And I think a lot of that has to do with the loading behavior of App Shell. Jeremy has written a bit about how App Shell is a little problematic. I think it's problematic for two reasons. One, as he points out, that people start looking at doing App Shell, and then they assume that they need to do a single-page application. And when they start doing a single-page application, they use it as sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card to ignore things like progressive enhancement, accessibility, all sorts of things that we would otherwise want. Like the progressive part of progressive enhancement gets left behind. It's also problematic because what ends up happening is people think that in order to do a progressive web app that you have to have a single-page application, that you have to do App Shell. And that's not true at all. Our site is a progressive web app. It loads regularly from page to page. We had built the site to be incredibly fast before we did the progressive web app, and we looked at the incremental speed up that we would get from doing a progressive web app as a single page application using App Shell, and we just couldn't justify doing all that extra work for something that was already really fast. All right, the fourth question. What part of your site should be made into a progressive web app? Again, part of this question of like what makes something an app. So Facebook on desktop is one application. But when you move to mobile, we've got the Facebook app, and then the Messenger app, and then the Events app, and then Pages, and Groups, and Moments, and I don't know, they've got too many apps. Like, they've got a ton of different applications. If you've got a large and complex site, it may not make sense for you to have a single progressive web app. It may make sense to have separate progressive web apps. I mean, if you're lucky, you're like Browser Sync or like our site, where a single site can become your progressive web app. I also think that there are organizations that may be better set up for making this decision. So Yahoo, for example, in their native applications, they've got a series of apps that map almost directly to subdomains. So like sports.yahoo.com is all about sports, and then they've got the Yahoo Sports app. And it seems really clear that it would make sense to have a progressive web app that was just the sports progressive web app. And it would be on a subdomain, and that team probably is separate from the other teams, and they could just build a progressive web app for sports.yahoo. I'm also really interested in this idea that I'm starting to talk about called tearaway apps, where you may have an entire website, and maybe for the entire website you use service workers to increase performance, but there's actually like one little bit that's a piece that people will want to take away from your site and have with them and available with them offline and have as the icon on their home screen. So Nest is a good example of this, because if you go to Nest's website, it's got a bunch of support information. It's actually a fairly large site. But when you log in, what you get is you basically get a web page with whatever your thermostats are. And it's a responsive design, really nice. You can go in, you can manage the thermostat, you can adjust the temperature. It works really well. It's a little janky in this video because my machine was getting a little taxed with the video recording, but it's actually really smooth. And it's not that different from what their native app experience is like. As a matter of fact, I found myself wondering if it's just a wrapper for the website. I don't know for certain one way or another. But you could see how something like this would really work. Like, I might, for Nest, not want the whole site as my progressive web app. I don't care about that. I just, as the part that I want to take away, I just want to take away this experience, my personal thermostat experience. So these are the 4 questions for progressive web apps. How much should your design match the platform? What impact does going Chromeless have on UX? Should you app shell or not app shell? And what part of your site should be made into a progressive web app? And these questions are really part of these bigger questions that I think we're going to wrestle with, because we have different ideas in our head about what makes something an app. And we don't yet know how users' expectations might change when they consider something to be an app, and when your icon that's a progressive web app is right next to an icon that's a native application. So we don't know the answers to that yet. But I think it's safe to say that the really great progressive web apps will get some of these details right. For example, figuring out what caching and offline strategy makes sense for your application. So the baseline experience could be to cache for performance and then provide an offline experience. So English Accents Map, it has a good example of this. This is a fun progressive web app where you can go in and you can select different areas, and then it'll show you a YouTube video where you can listen to some different accents from around the world. This is Somerset, and I think it's the funniest one I've found so far.
Where are you?
Blackbird on Abbey.
I'll catch that blackbird one day.
A farming implement.
Gert digger.
We haven't rehearsed that one.
Gertler.
Oh, what a beautiful day it is. Would you like to come and enjoy the lovely sunshine with me?
Drink up ye cider.
All right, my lover.
So it's really fun. I encourage you to go watch some of the videos. It's also very educational to hear this. But if you go offline, you can continue to scroll through the list of different locations, but you're offline. You can't access the YouTube videos. The map is no longer available. They provide you with a note that says, hey, you're offline now. You can favorite this so that you could come back to it later. So they've added one little bit of extra functionality. But otherwise, once you're offline, you're offline. That's it. But they do provide sort of that fallback to let you know. Then you might get a little bit more complex. So when we worked on Smashing Magazine, prior to the redesign, we helped them with service workers. And what we did for them was they wanted to cache recently read articles and then a series of articles that they thought that people would commonly want to have access to. This is very similar actually to what we did for our own site. So if you're on our site and then you go offline, we show an indicator at the top of the site that says, hey, you're now offline. And if you browse to a page that you've previously been on, you can continue to read that content. But if you browse to a page that you haven't viewed recently, we provide you with a notification that says that you're offline. Now, we had a lot of discussions about what made sense for us. Our first instinct was to cache all of the top-level pages, so it felt more app-like, so that you could go offline and you could just like move around from the top-level pages and see all the content. And so our idea was the first time somebody hit the site, we would just pre-cache those top-level pages. But the reality is that the vast majority of the people who come to our site for the articles we write. We spend a lot of time writing and sharing the things that we learn about the web. And we get so much more traffic to that. Like 90% of our traffic are to those articles. Very few people are like, hey, what do they do? And like, what's their approach? I mean, it would be great. Like, I would love if more people read those. Like, that would be awesome for our business. But that's not really what happens. And it seems unfair for somebody who's on a metered connection on the other side of the world to download all of our sales material when they're trying to read about responsive images or something like that. So we decided to only cache things that somebody had already visited. You could also implement something where you let somebody choose what they want offline. So Jake Archibald did this example of a Wikipedia site where somebody could have a slider and they say add to offline. And now they're creating a reading list, right? And in doing this, there are a bunch of UI affordances that need to be presented. How do we tell somebody what's happening? How do we let them see what is available to them to read offline? How do we let them remove stuff from reading offline? In some instances, it may make sense to cache stuff ahead of time. So in this case, this is a Pokédex. It's just another demo. But right off the bat, all of the content is cached. Happens to be a very small site. It makes a lot of sense. This is something that you should do only if you have a good understanding of what your users will expect. Right? Maybe as a software as a service company, people pay you money, they're in your application all the time. That would be a good time to pre-cache a bunch of stuff to provide them with a really fast experience. But if it's a marketing site, like caching everything on your site ahead of time is probably a bad decision. So when people talk about doing something offline, right, the choice between doing sort of something for performance or doing something where you're pre-caching, like that's a big difference in the potential scope of your project. Another thing that you should look at is if you are using AMP, what is the path from AMP to a PWA? So AMP is the accelerated mobile project. If you probably have encountered it even if you didn't know that you were encountering it. So in search results on Google, there's this little slider carousel, and then articles open up very quickly. AMP is a subset of HTML, sort of like a custom elements for HTML that Google believes that if you implement something in AMP, that they know that that page is going to be very fast. And that's why they show it in search results and sort of feature it prominently. And well, anyways, I have some opinions about AMP. Like, I think AMP is. I was at Google I/O earlier this year, and they announced that AMP now had over 2 billion pages, and the whole audience applauded. And I'm like, you all are applauding because we failed. Like, we failed to build stuff fast enough, and so AMP exists, right? And now we've got 2 billion web pages that when we do our work and make our own, like, the progressive web apps, we convert all of our sites to progressive web apps, and they're all fast. All of those AMP pages are going to have to go away because they're not necessary, right? If we do our job, AMP doesn't need to exist. Now that said, like, we've had clients where doing AMP makes financial sense. Like, I can't argue against that. If Google is going to put a carousel with your products higher if you develop an AMP page, then it probably makes sense for you to develop an AMP page. What you can do, though, is that you can make sure that when you do that AMP page, that you use the technology to install the service worker when somebody visits that AMP page. So it gets installed behind the scenes. And then when they move on to your progressive web app, it's much faster. So good thing to do. Push notifications, right? Like, we've got this new exciting bit of technology, and what's everybody doing? They're just like immediately prompting somebody, like, do you want push notifications? It's like you go and you meet somebody for dinner, and before you even say hello, you're like, will you marry me? Right? Like, I don't know you that well. Like, this is too much of a relationship commitment to ask for right off the bat. And the reality is, even though they're new to us, they're not new to our users. They've had notifications on native platforms for a long time, and they are annoyed by them. So if we're going to play in this space, we need to understand that that's what we're walking into. We need to make sure that we prompt for push notifications in a context in which somebody is more likely to actually want to do it. On our own site, the way that we looked at this was we thought, hey, we'd like to do this, but maybe it's not the most important thing. So at the end of an article, if somebody's read something good, that might be a good time to put a button that says, do you want notifications? Only after they click the button do we do the browser prompt to ask if they want notifications. Then we send them a note that says, thank you for subscribing. But they can turn off the notifications also from within the web page. Twitter Lite does this really well as well. So they don't prompt for a notification until you click on the @ symbol, which takes you to the replies and favorites and all the things that you normally might want to get notified about. And then they show this overlay and they say, hey, do you want to turn on notifications? If you say yes, then they do the browser prompt. And if you allow it, then they show you a little bar that says notifications have been turned on. Here's where you can go to adjust the settings for notifications. In both of these instances, you notice that we're not immediately using the browser prompt. We're actually sort of asking somebody to take one action before we use the permission. And that's really important because browsers are implementing kill switches. So if you prompt for notification and somebody declines your prompt, you won't get to ask again. Right? You get to do it once. You tick somebody off and they say no, like you're not going to get the option to prompt them again for notifications. And this is going to become even more important in the next version of Chrome. So what Google has found right now is that on the left there, which is Chrome 62, is sort of the current interface for notifications. So there's a prompt that says allow or block and an X that you can dismiss it or you can tap in the page and dismiss it. And most people actually just dismiss the prompt. They don't make a decision to allow it or to block it. They just go away. In Chrome 63, the X is going away. The ability to dismiss the modal goes away entirely. Users will be forced to either block your request or allow your request. And the reason they're making this change is to force people to stop asking for permission all the time when it's not time when somebody is likely to accept the permission. So now the penalty is the person can't just dismiss it, they'll block it, and then you'll never be able to ask again. So it's really important to get this UX right. Owen Campbell-Moore, who I mentioned earlier, has written this really great document for best practices for push notifications, permissions, UX. If you're going to go implement push notifications, pull up this document and just follow it. Like, it's really, really good. That's what we did at Cloud 4. All right, so hopefully you've got to this point. You're like, hey, this is awesome. We want to do a progressive web app. How do we start putting together our plan? And this is where I have to admit to you that that I think progressive web apps are incredibly punny, and maybe it's because I'm a dad and I like dad jokes. But I think progressive web apps, they're just ripe for puns. Like, progressive web apps are progressive because they use progressive enhancement. Okay, that's not that funny, right? But I mean, like, it's true. I also think they're progressive because they promote a progressive relationship with people who visit your site, right? Like the first visit, like behind the scenes stuff happens, but otherwise you're just like, hey, like, hello, how you doing? And then the second visit, it's like, it's so much faster. What happened there? Well, that's because the service workers were installed. And then maybe the third visit, you notice that they're doing something that might prompt you to say, hey, would you like notifications? And they're like, sure, like we've had some good interactions in the past. And then at some point the browser detects engagement and the browser says, hey, do you want to add it to the home screen, right? Instead of just like launching into, will you marry me? Like that relationship with the customer goes progressively. The person gets more engaged with your site. And progressive web apps are progressive because we can progressively build them. This is what we did for our site. We knew that we had a redesign coming. We knew that we wanted to do a progressive web app. And so for our redesign, we made the move from HTTP to HTTPS as part of what we were planning to do. We also did a lot of performance stuff. A couple months later, we added a service worker, and we had a very simple offline fallback. The service worker was only being used for performance, sort of that baseline offline experience. And at that point, it was technically a progressive web app. But we weren't done, right? Next, we added offline pages. So we cached recently viewed pages. We also did a better job of adding an offline indicator, that notification bar on the top, and we did some more performance tweaks. This is a theme. Then we added push notifications, and we also did some more performance tweaks. And then about a month later, we actually announced the site, right? At that point, we had a progressive web app that we told people about. But we didn't stop. We continue to incrementally improve our website to make that progressive web app better. And again, because we're doing this incrementally, every step that was on that roadmap made sense on its own. We provided value at each point, right? When we implemented a service worker, people were getting a faster experience, even though they didn't know that then it was technically a progressive web app. So unlike a native application where you have to do all the work and then bundle up this huge binary and ship it all at once, a progressive web app allows you to add this stuff to your site incrementally and provide that value along the way. Now, I will add one caveat to that, which is that if your site is so slow that people walk out of the room while it loads, you're probably going to have to address that before you can do the progressive web app stuff. But otherwise, you can do a progressive web app incrementally. So I started by talking about the hype around progressive web apps and how it annoyed me. And what annoys me is that it's hype around the wrong things. It's like native versus mobile and web and all of that stuff. And instead, like, I've spent the last hour talking all about the hype about progressive web apps because there are a lot of things to be excited about with them. And it's not just progressive web apps. There are also things that aren't technically progressive web apps, but I think are also part of what the web is now capable of that's really exciting. For example, the Credential Management API allows you to automatically log people into your website if they've logged in the past. So you can get people in more quickly. Another API that's new is the Payment Request API, which allows you to build a checkout flow where when somebody goes to check out, they basically get an interface from the operating system with all the stored credit cards on the mobile device or on the desktop browser, and they can just pay very, very quickly. This Payment Request API is actually very similar to what Apple Pay on the web is. As a matter of fact, Apple has committed to the fact that for the next version of the Payment Request API, that they will converge, that Apple Pay on the web and the Payment Request API will come into one thing. So we're now reaching this point where you can actually build something that's not only fast, but somebody can actually interact and purchase things quickly. And I want to show you this video from WeGo, which is a travel company that sort of pulls together all of these themes and how they've been able to use progressive web apps and AMP and iOS and how they've all come together to provide a much better experience. So you see all the pieces, all those disparate pieces sort of put together. You can see the impact that it's having for that company and their business. To me, that's the really exciting part, is that even on desktop web, we haven't been able to build experiences that were that fluid, that fast, allowed somebody to get in and do the things that they wanted to do and get out. And now we have that capability. The stuff that's part of PWAs, the stuff that's not part of PWAs, even things like CSS animations allow us to build the sorts of experiences that we could only dream of in the past. And so I'm really excited because I feel like we're on the verge of a renaissance for the web in terms of the capabilities and the sorts of experiences that we can design. So my question, my proposal to you is, I want you to go back to your organizations and start thinking about what progressive web apps would make sense for you, and build one, and then share it and talk about the benefits of it. Thank you very much.